So hey everybody, glad you're here tonight, even though there's two things that make tonight a little sadder than a typical Sunday night class. Really three things. One is it is hot as blazing out there, and we ought to all be like sitting in a pool somewhere or up, by a mountain stream. That's the first thing that makes it a little sad. Second is the topic is depression, and that's just not something you go, hey, let's go over to church and talk about depression. Third reason that it's kind of a difficult day is that that we've just gone through a lot in our church, and depression was a piece of that. Suicide has with it, and we're going to talk about, and I won't say names or anything, but there was a lot of people involved in his life that were doing the right things, and just really was impressed with what was provided for him. But we'll talk about what will you do if somebody talks about suicide, and somebody will. And we need to be very mindful of that in our church, because one of the risk factors for suicide is if somebody in your sphere of influence committed suicide. So that suicides tend to go in clusters. Like after Robin Williams committed suicide a few years ago, the comedian, there was a rash of suicides. Because at some level, for most of us, this is kind of going later into a lecture, but for most of us, suicide's not on our tool belt for dealing with life. It's just not on there. It's not, we're aware of it, and we know some people do that. However, if somebody in your family or somebody in your immediate sphere, or if somebody at your high school commits suicide, all of a sudden it kind of puts it on the tool belt. It's like, well, that's something I might do. Everybody at some point has thought about killing themselves, or just maybe everybody's at least has thought, gosh, it would just be easier. The easiest way out of this mess would be for God to take me home in a bus tomorrow. That would be but most people don't do that because it's not on their tool belt. It's just not on this doesn't, and that's one of the sad things about suicide. The legacy of suicide is that if you committed suicide, then your kids will be more likely to consider that as an option later on in their life, because it kind of gets put on their tool belt. Does that make sense? But that's a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's pray together, and then we'll talk about depression and what a Christian perspective to that, and we'll kind of go from there. Father, we must seem like little children coming together, trying to figure it all out. And ultimately, the complexity and the sorrow of this world is supposed to bring us to you. And some of it doesn't get all figured out. But Father, we really want to be faithful to the people you send to us. We want to be faithful to our friends, our kids, our families, our spouses, and when they're struggling. And I pray that you'd use the time that we spend together today to maybe help us with some things to do practically when somebody's struggling. So be with us now, we pray in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen. So it's kind of interesting. The common cold in mental illness today is probably not depression anymore. It was for years. That was the most common thing. But now it's probably anxiety. And we'll talk next time about anxiety and why that makes sense that would be on the rise. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with an incredibly simple understanding of depression. And then I'm going to kind of complicate it up the rest of the night. So it doesn't get, remember, all issues are a combination of nature, nurture, and choice. And there is a biological piece to depression, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how the brain works and how God built the brain to really guard you from depression. But if it gets turned sideways a little bit, if the thermostat shifts, then the very mechanism that God set in there to kind of keep you from being depressed makes it hard to change the momentum of depression. Depression can feel like a momentum that's hard to shift once it starts going in a direction. And so we'll talk a little about the biological part. But I think the most helpful thing to know is kind of the spiritual and psychological part of depression, because that's something you can help people disciple people with. If somebody's depressed and you say, well, I gave them 5 Bible verses, and they wrote those down, and that they may be helpful at some level, but that's the choice piece of depression, and probably that's the smallest of the percentages of what causes depression. So here's the beautiful thing that we're going to have to kind of say, all right, if somebody's struggling with depression who's in my world, what would I be thinking about? And here's the oversimplified statement is depression is a blocked goal that becomes unattainable, or a loss that starts to feel irretrievable. And now I don't mean a lot. I had a goal like, I wanted to, get a parking spot in front of Walmart. That's I don't mean a goal like that. I mean a goal like I want my dad's approval, or my kids to turn out okay, or I want my wife to love me, or I want my husband to love me, or I want my, those deep longings that usually have to do with relationship and impact, that with significance and security, the things that the existentialists would say, the very things that drive us, purpose and relationship and connection. When one of those deep goals starts to feel blocked, at first, when a goal gets blocked, what do? You might even actually get angry and say, I'm going to try harder. I'm going to try plan B. But if after you've tried plan B and plan C and plan D, and you still hit where it's not working, and then you get to a place where you go, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think I'm going to get that. That's just a fertile ground for depression. Yeah.
Can you say the definition again?
Sure. The genesis of depression, spiritually and psychologically, is a blocked goal that starts to feel unattainable, or a significant loss that becomes irretrievable. And so let's just use a silly example, and then we'll kind of bring it to. If I wanted to go buy a pair of shoes, obviously that's not a deep goal. So I want to go buy a pair of shoes, and I wanted to kind of wear them tonight. And so at 2:00 this afternoon, Skylar and I rush out, to look for a pair of shoes. And by the way, do you know what this is? That's someone stealing a pair of shoes from Walmart. Yeah. Many of you won't get that. And the reason you won't get that is you've never bought shoes at Walmart. And you'd go, why would he be jumping? Because at Walmart, they put the shoes tied together. And so if you, listen, the humor that you get for tonight's class is absolutely free. That's because it's bad humor. But so we go in the store and we look for some shoes and we can't find them. And so what do I do at first? I go, I can't believe Target doesn't have shoes that I can wear. It's no big deal. I'm going to go across to Shoe Shack or whatever's over there, and then I'm going to say, and I go in, they don't have the shoe I have. And then I go to the next one. What happens is you begin to kind of go, you initially get angry, and that anger will motivate you to try something new. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. But after you've exhausted the possibilities, and usually it's the goal that somebody else's behavior changes. Somebody wants me. My dad respects me. My wife loves me. My husband loves me. Those sort of things. My kids turn out okay. It's usually something that has to do with another person. And when that goal starts to feel unattainable, that's where you find the genesis of depression. And so after all my strategies to try to fix that, that becomes lost. And you think, well, why? Because so many of us have this. We say, I'm going to be happy when blank happens. And if I ever get a fully funded 401k, you'd think at 67 I would have already had that, but that's not the case. Then I'd be happy. Well, no, what we find is that often whatever we're filling the blank in, I'll be happy when, first of all, often that doesn't happen. And then second, when you get that, often it doesn't fix the problem. And that's where you'll find us start to feel that despair of depression. What's the use? How I don't care. It doesn't matter. But initially, people will try harder. If I put $1 in the Coke machine and the Coke doesn't come out, what I don't do is stop and be reflective. What I do is I try my first strategy harder. So I hit the button, and then when that doesn't work, I start banging on the machine and hitting the button. We get pretty stubborn to try to get our goal. And so what's really helpful is if you're discipling somebody who's depressed, get curious about what that goal might be. And I think it's usually going to be around something about their significance or something about security. But by security, I mean love. By significance, I mean esteem. And what's really interesting is if that's the truth, if what I said is accurate, then you either have to change, you have to get what you want to not be depressed anymore, or change what you want. And so, how can you change? So the only way to change what you want, so I can't, I want my kids to have a good, godly life. And so, they're really doing pretty well. All my kids know Jesus at this point, but there's some things I wish that were different. In terms of some of the things they do and don't do, and there's a point where if that's an okay desire, it's kind of a normal desire, but if it becomes a goal, it becomes an idol. I need them to change in order for me to be okay. And that's what kind of gets tied up in our depression. Our depression is, and that's often why depression happens after a big event. Now, obviously, there's biological reasons for postnatal depression. There's obviously biological issues of hormones, but it's also, gosh, once our kid's born, everything's gonna be great. No, once the kid's born, there's more to do. And our marriage will get better once the kids are here because it'll give us a task to do together. It helped for a little bit, but it's actually made it's not solved the problem. It's not solved that goal. And so what you can do is if you're discipling somebody who's depressed and you start to become curious about that, what is that goal? What is that goal that they long for that's not being met? And it could be, and then you can begin to suggest to them, so what could you change? Well, I can change the goal from I want my kids to be okay to I can be a good supportive father to my adult children. I can control that. And I can have some movement around that. I may not be able to control whether my dad respects me or not, but I can control whether I'm a respectable human being that he should respect. I may not be able to guarantee that my marriage will be good, but I can focus on the fact that what would it be for me to be a good husband? And that changes everything. And I don't mean like it would change overnight depression, but it is incredibly empowering for somebody to say, wait a minute, there's a part of this I can move toward and control and deal with. It's not completely out of my control and my deal with it. And there's a real some real life that's given in that. Does that make sense? So think about when you kind of struggle with depression in your life. What goal? What goal started to flip through your fingers and not be met? And my guess is it'll be things like that we've talked about. There was a goal that's really important to me that's been blocked. Does that make sense? I I mean, I love Skylar. And rarely do I think what Mona and I struggle with is depression. But there are times when we're brought face to face with what he will not become. That moves toward depression, that moves toward does that make sense? Now, it's kind of important that we talk about the difference between disappointment and depression. Depression is really a clinical diagnosis. We overuse it. We overuse the word, I'm depressed. I mean, you're not depressed if you've just been blue for a day. And a matter of fact, if there are not days that you're blue or sad, you live in a fallen world. And if there aren't days that you really wrestle and struggle with the fallenness of it, you're not living in the truth. But depression is a long-term movement in the direction of of giving up. What's the use? I'm going to give some symptoms of depression in just a minute, some ways to remember that. But that's kind of the idea of depression. Does that make sense? So think about the people you know that are a little depressed. And just think about their life and think about what disappointment have they internalized? What goal, what dream has been lost? Because whenever a dream is lost, there's going to be a potential for a movement toward depression. Does that make sense? Well, let me just talk about depression in the clinical form. Clinically, is considered it's considered a mood disorder or emotion disorder, and it's interesting. Within the mood disorders, there's depression, all sorts of it, and then there's bipolar 1 and 2, and bipolar is kind of somebody who fluctuates between depression and mania or hypomania, right below mania, and that's fairly common that we'd fluctuate in our emotions. But if it's very predictable and tends to be extreme, then that's something we call. Some people have said, well, why isn't there a mania disorder? Because if there's a depressive disorder, why isn't there a mania disorder? And that's because mania is, your body can't sustain mania for long. I mean, there's a point, if you ever met somebody who is in a full-blown manic episode, I mean, it is, they're not sleeping much, their energy level is, the guy that wrote Handel's Messiah, it was Handel, that's his name. That's how I got his name. Why did I get stuck there? He was bipolar or manic depressive, and he wrote that incredibly complicated thing that we sing at Christmas in just a matter of days, and it should have taken, years for him to do it, but because it's so complicated and beautiful in so many parts. But he was in that manic. So there was a guy at our church a few years ago who bought 11 cars. This was before everything was electronic, so it didn't catch up with him. He bought 11 cars in one day on a manic episode. And then when he kind of crashes, he signed papers for 11 cars that have all lost value because they've all come off the lot. You're not always making good decisions in those manic episodes, but you can't stay there. And so that's why the mood disorders are depressive or manic depressive, but they're not. Does that make sense? All right. So I told you that's really simple. So somebody's before you, they're struggling with depression. That means chances are they've got a blocked goal that they need to face, and we need to help them switch from an unattainable goal to something they can control that they can move toward to get better. So somebody's marriage is falling apart. Their husband's going to leave them. And they get depressed when it doesn't look like this is going to it doesn't look like this is going to work. It doesn't look like my marriage is going to work. And that's a deep, deep longing, and that woman might say, if you were seeing that woman, there may be a way to begin to say, well, you can't control what he does, but you can control, what kind of person you are in this, and give them something to do, because at some level they've lost. They're lost in the fact that what I want most will not happen, and that's depression. Let me give you the clinical symptoms for depression. SIGI CAPS, if we want an anonym or for it, but SIGI CAPS stands for sleep disturbance, because people who struggle with depression tend to not sleep well. As a matter of fact, if you struggle with midsomnia, meaning you'd fall asleep, then you wake up in the middle of the night, and then you can't get back to sleep, and then maybe like at 4 a.m. you go back to sleep, but it's like that's a really common sign of depression. It's called midsomnia, but sleep dysfunction is a pretty common symptom. Sleep disturbance, interest or lack of interest in things. A depressed person starts to lose interest even in the things they used to like. When I've kind of been depressed in my life, I'm a horrible musician. I mean, there's people that I don't even make eye contact with. Like I don't look at you at all. I never kind of make eye contact with you out of just deep shame. But in spite of the fact that I'm a horrible musician, I like to play guitar, and I like music. And you can find, and sometimes that's almost a thermostat for me to say, is he moving toward depression? Because you start to lose interest in the things you enjoy, the things that you, so kind of a diminished interest in life, even things that you'd consider fun. So this would affect the sex life in a marriage. This would affect because they're just kind of, what's the use? Next, you'll see kind of a next SIGI, G would be guilt. Guilt and feelings of worthlessness. And once that starts, the momentum of that feeling worthless, that's hard to push against that. It's like a ball rolling down a hill, and you start, I'm just a goober head, and and it just starts to roll down that hill, and it's hard to change the momentum of that for people. So guilt and feeling worthless, loss of energy, loss of energy. People will often, even though they won't sleep well, they'll often be in bed a long time. Whenever I'm seeing a depressed person, I try to have early morning appointments for them. And I go, gosh, the only time I have available for it is like 7 o'clock on Tuesday. And if they looked at my calendar, they go, no, you've got 8, 9, 10. What? It's because I want to make them get up at 7 in the morning because they're depressed and they didn't sleep well, and so they'll just kind of linger in bed all day, and then they'll feel. Then what happens after they've lingered in bed too long? I can't believe I didn't do anything. I'm just worthless. I can't believe and then that can kind of feed some of that symptomology.
Never meeting you at Cracker Barrel ever again.
But that's it. The Cracker Barrel is my go-to place for depressed people. So next is in the SIGI CAPS would be concern, but it's really just a difficulty in feeling indecisive. It's hard to make decisions. Don't get a depressed person to reorganize their closet. Get a depressed person to kind of clean the sink. You know what I mean? If it's like, if you say, well, you just need to do something. Why don't you go clean out your, why don't you go clean out your garage? If somebody said that to us at our house, our garage makes like a junkyard look organized. And so if somebody said, you're kind of depressed, why don't you need to do something? Go out and clean your garage. That's horrible advice to give to somebody who's depressed, because they're just going to sit there and go, but so for somebody who's depressed, why? Because one of the symptoms of depression is an indecision, the ability to make a decision. Because that feeling of hopelessness makes you go, it doesn't matter. Does it matter what I do? Does it matter if I do this? If I just do this, I'm going to have to do it again. So difficulties with indecisiveness. Appetite would be next. And sometimes appetite can go up. Sometimes it can go down. But food often becomes a weapon of emotion in our lives. Food is rarely about food. If you ever see me at a all-you-can-eat pizza place and Skylar's not with me, call Mona, because I'm probably depressed. Because nobody really should eat that much pizza in one sitting. But I know that food can be a way of, food can become a friend to somebody who's depressed. I'll eat a lot, or it can be the opposite. I just don't care about anything, but it rarely stays the same. And so that means weight will go up or down often with people that are depressed. And so if their weight goes up when they're depressed, then they go like, I hate, I'm so worthless, I can't. So anyway, appetite, abnormal weight change. Up next would be psychomotor retardation or agitation, which is just a fancy way of saying you walk slower, you move slower, or you move, or with some kids that are under the age of 20, 19, 18, below that, sometimes their depression comes across real active. And so instead of psychomotor retardation, like it would be for most adults, there's some younger people, when they get depressed, it'll kind of look a little manicky because there's a desperateness that's just kind of going. And so those would be the kind of the symptoms that if you were going to have to diagnose somebody. And then last is the last SIGI caps. The last S is suicide or feeling like what's the use. And we're going to talk specifically about suicide in a few minutes. So that's depression. And that is different from feeling blue or having a bad day or kind of just, depression has to last for a long time and has to get pretty deep. Now, at what point do you say, well, is it, and here's what a lot of people say, well, if it's spiritual, let's deal with it spiritually. If it's medical, let's deal with it medically. But that's the trick. The way God built your brain and the way God built your body is fearfully and wonderfully made, and is very complex. And I had a pastor come to me one time and he said, I'm here because I'm depressed, but it's not spiritual, it's just biochemical. And so I don't want you to judge me. And I said, well, I kind of deal with you the same way, whether, no matter, and he goes, well, no, but it's not behavioral. There's no sin here. And I said, well, today let's just not look for sin. Let's look for truth and let's see what's going on in your life. And, but there was something about it that it's like, if it's biological, it's okay. But if it's psychological or spiritual, then there's something wrong with me. And I just want to tell you, I don't think there's a scalpel sharp enough to know the difference at times. And if you're depressed for spiritual reasons long enough, your body will respond to that, and it'll be physiological as well. So let me give you just a real quick. I said I'd make it complicated. I said I'd give you something very simple about depression, and then I'd make it complicated. And so let me talk about the biological piece of depression. The thing that we know the least about is the brain. In some ways, medical science is fascinating. What they've come up with and what they're doing. But in terms of when it comes to the brain, we're just a couple stages ahead of a witch doctor with a dead chicken shaking it over your head, because the brain is beautiful and amazing, but we don't know. We have theories, but we don't know how a memory really is stored. We don't know we understand that the brain has a system that is amazing, that is interconnected. There's pathways that are created, and we know that if there's been trauma in your life, that God set your brain up to have an automatic response to protect you. And so, and that's the limbic system. That's why you don't have to think about when you put your finger on a real hot surface. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to go, my finger is burning right now, and that's probably really a bad thing. And I'm going to go ahead and move that. You don't need. You just go. It's just sensation. Boom. Goes to the limbic system. It really goes to the hind part of the brain and comes right back, and it's an automatic response. And so, the brain is fascinating in that way. But we are set up in our normal state. We are set up beautifully to weather the fallen world. We're wired to be slightly anxious, and we're wired to be somewhat resistant to depression, and we're wired to be addicted to good things, not bad things. What we call mental disorders is a hijacking of those good systems that God put in your brain that was meant for good, but the thermostat's been changed, if you will. And so I'm just going to talk real quick about, anybody here a medical doctor or did pre-med in college? Any nurses here? Okay, so if you would, in the middle of what I'm about to say, just rip something and say, this is heresy. Yeah, so this is kind of like Barney the dinosaur teaches physiology. But we're gonna talk about how the brain works when it comes to depression. The nervous system is fascinating, and the nervous system communicates both electrically and chemically. And the chemical that is there are called neurotransmitters. And in your nervous system, there are neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters are set to move up the nervous system to kind of protect you, to kind of deal with different things. And so everybody in here knows somebody who's on an antidepressant. I mean, if I said, who's on an antidepressant in the room, I'm not going to ask that because it would embarrass people, because about 3/4 of you would go, I'm on one, because it is, and what's that's called? It's called a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or an SRI, right? You've heard people say, well, they're taking an SRI. That's what Prozac is. That's what most of those drugs are. SRIs that deal with a serotonin is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical in the body that is used to fire at certain times. And so if you'll just bear with me, the nervous system is made up of neurons, and the neurons, between the neurons, there's a gap. It's called the synaptic gap. And that gap, you're obviously very smart. You know everything I'm saying because I said this and I saw this look like. Oh, okay. So you're going to say that is a little too simple, but so the synaptic gap, that's where synaptics go to buy genes. The synaptic gap. It's the gap where the synapses go. Okay. And so what happens is the nerves, the neurons are of fire or not fire. I mean, and so if there's enough serotonin in between this gap, it'll make this cell fire. And it fires, and that will shoot serotonin into that gap. And the more serotonin, the less you'll be affected by depression. Does that make sense? So that system, that neurotransmitter system, is built to protect you. And serotonin also deals with weight. That's why people that take SRIs often gain weight. Why would that be? Well, in God's system, He knew that when people are depressed, they quit eating. And so part of the way that serotonin works is it deals with both of those things, which frustrates people who take the SRIs because it's like, I'm depressed and I've now just gained weight, and now I'm depressed because I gained weight. But so anyway, so this cell fires, and and responds, and there's serotonin in the gap. And so with this cell fires, and it fires, and that's going to, and then when that gets up to the brain, that's going to give you a sense of resilience. Some people who take SRIs at first say they feel a little bit disconnected when they first start taking them, because it does give you a sense of I can do this, I can push through this, I'll be okay. And so now what happens is there's receptors that take this serotonin back into this cell. So this cell fires, shoots serotonin in the gap. This cell fires, shoots serotonin in the gap. But after a while, because you don't stay in a heightened state all the time, after a while, this cell begins to pull back the serotonin. And so a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, this is reuptake when it goes back in, right? And so all that does, the serotonin reuptake inhibitor blocks the serotonin from going back in, makes it stay in the gap longer, and since it stays in the gap longer, you get that resilience a little bit longer, or a little bit stronger. Does that make sense? And that's why these antidepressants that are out, are really blocking a symptom. They're not solving a problem, but they usually work at some level, because they're working with that system, and they're flooding that serotonin into the gap longer, so that cell will fire. Does that make sense? And so that's why it's also, have you ever heard somebody say you don't get off those quickly, and sometimes it takes up to 6 weeks for it to take full effect? Well, that's because it's messing it's not like alcohol that's a central nervous system depressant that immediately you feel that, or a drug that you immediately feel. These things that deal with body chemistry, it takes a while for that chemistry to start to change, the inertia of that to change. And so some of the different serotonin reuptake inhibitors will have different half-life in the body, and so they're basically have the same mechanism, but there's just a little bit of difference in the way that how long they stay, and therefore the side effects and that sort of stuff. But that's how those work. They're not magic. They are blocking a symptom. You haven't dealt with your blocked goal or your lost dreams or your traumas of your life, but you have blocked the feeling of depression. The reason that people who get on these medicines have a higher risk of suicide, and this is important that you know this. The reason that it takes a little bit of courage, though foolish courage, to kill yourself. And somebody who's really depressed doesn't want to do anything. I mean, they're just, but what sometimes happens is they begin to take one of these serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they get a little more energy in them, a little more life to them, because that's how the system works. Remember, if serotonin's in the gap, it gives you more resilience. And so, but if you haven't dealt with what might be underneath it, or the reason for the depression, and you give somebody energy, their risk for suicide goes up. If you have high energy and deep depression, that person's more at risk for suicide than somebody with low energy in deep depression, because it takes, it's fool's courage, but it does take courage to meet Jesus on your terms instead of his. I mean, and like I said, it's fool's courage, but it does take some level of courage. I remember overhearing some high school kids once when there was a rash of suicides in one of the high schools down in Orlando, and one of the kids said something like, "I wish I had the courage to do what so-and-so did. But I don't have the guts to do that." I mean, and so that's why. Does that make sense? So, so the reason that there is a biological component to depression. We are not on an even playing field. Some people's brains are more susceptible to depression than others. Some people have more serotonin than others in their regular system. And so you don't need to be all judgmental if somebody's depressed and say, well, you just don't trust Jesus, because they may just, their brain might work a little differently than yours, and have some grace for people, especially that are struggling with depression. But let me give you just so the idea that some people might be, I'll tell you what, let me just take a step back and say there's nothing wrong with blocking a symptom temporarily if there's also a commitment to work on what might be the cause. For years, I've had high cholesterol, and they put me on a statin drug. And I thought, that's great. A statin drug is really permission to eat pizza and buffalo wings all the time. And that's really not what it's supposed to be. I mean, what it's supposed to be is, hey, we'll let you take this will lower your cholesterol till you can get yourself in order and start eating better food. And I kept thinking, no, this is permission for pizza. And we live in a culture, in a medical culture, that is very quick to, if I fix the symptom, we've solved the problem. And we haven't. And I predict within 5 years, I think serotonin reuptake inhibitors will be put in our water. I mean, it's going to be just as, well, let me just give you a real life example. 50 years ago, if you went to the emergency room with an ulcer, they would have said, boy, that's a spiritual or relational problem. You probably need to see a counselor or a pastor. Avoid these certain foods, and come back and see me. If you came in about 10 years later, same doctor, they'd say, well, listen, I've got this class X drug that I can give you, but I don't want you to get too dependent on it. It'll block the production of acid in your stomach. And so while you go see the doctor, while you go see your pastor, and while you go see a counselor, and deal with the causes of the depression, I'm going to give you this prescription, but I don't want you to get too dependent on it. I want you to deal with that. 5 years after that, the guy comes in and he's got a little bit of upset stomach. They go, here, give you this prescription. Now you could go to Walmart and back up your truck to the door and get this wonder class X drug called Tagamet. Because what did it do? It blocked the production of acid. What makes you produce acid in your stomach? When you're nervous, when you're anxious, when you eat the bad foods. And so they just said, well, your stomach produced too much acid. Let's give that to you, and that'll get rid of your. But 20 years ago, they would have said, you need to see a pastor or a counselor because you're worrying too much. And so it's an example of where we have learned to block a symptom, and so we don't think very deeply about what might be under it. Now, there's nothing wrong with blocking a symptom. If you're depressed, I hope you take an antidepressant. I don't want you to, that depression, that's hard, but I'd love for you to see it as kind of a jump start to help me with the process to kind of think through now. I'm going to talk to a pastor or a counselor and talk about that blocked goal, that demand that I have on God, that He gives me life on my terms instead of on His terms. In 2 weeks, I will be in. I'll be in Melbourne, Florida, working with Campus Crusade for Christ staff that have been in the Ukraine. They brought them over, and they're going to give them 2 weeks of kind of a holiday, and I'm teaching for them for a full week in the mornings, and I thought, what do you tell them? They've gone through incredible trauma, and they're going back to it. And if God doesn't do a miracle, literally, if God doesn't do a miracle, there's only about 60,000 Ukrainian men that have not served yet. There's millions of Russian soldiers. If God doesn't do a miracle, within the next year and a half, Ukraine will be, it's almost destroyed now, but it'll be, so they go back into that. And I think God built our system, our brain, our biology to be able to weather a fallen world. But it's not, we kind of see the living in a fallen world, having a problem, having a crisis, kind of as an elevator. You know, I'm at the bottom, I've got depression, I'm going to apply these things, I'm going to get better, and then I'm going to come out of it. I think what I'm looking at in Lamentations is there's those poems in Lamentations that are about a person who lost their country. He lost his country, and they're great. He's in exile. He didn't want that. And those dark poems. And then in the middle of the book, in chapter 3, there's this beautiful, but your mercies are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. That song we sing comes from this incredibly dark book of Lamentations. And it kind of shows a pattern that I'm going to talk to the people about, that instead of seeing kind of dealing with the fallen world as kind of an elevator or a journey that I'm on, you more likely would see it as a Ferris wheel, that I grieve without hope. I acknowledge, then I go to God with my grief and talk about what I've lost. And then somehow you grieve with hope, but then you go back into the grief because the world's still fallen. But you're in a different place because you've dealt with that. And then you go through that same process again. And as you grow, now that won't sell books because we want a God that solves all our problems easily. But I'm not sure remember, I'm not sure God is interested in solving your problems as much as he's wanting to use your problems to bring you to him. And so I can't stand before those people and say, you know, God's not going to let your country fall. I can't say that. I can't say God is good in spite of how bad this feels. And that if you'll be honest with him, if you'll lament the way the poems in Lamentations lament, you'll be invited to be honest with God, honest with yourself, find no hope and then find hope in Christ, and then enter back into the sadness and follow that again. And there's a depth that comes with that. Maybe not an easy life, but there's a depth that comes with that. Because you can't promise that's one of the problems with Pentecostal theology. I mean, I don't know how many people I know that have gone to a Pentecostal church and had a deliverance experience. And at some level, it was real. I mean, I think it was a moment where they got on the Ferris wheel and they saw the hope in Christ. But then when they enter back into the grief that you have to because you still live in a fallen world, they think, what went wrong? It didn't happen. There wasn't anything. And they begin to doubt everything because they weren't told that this is to sustain you and to look back on it, but you'll be entering back into despair. But now you know the pathway to hope in that. Does that make sense? So I've talked about the biology of it, that some people have more serotonin than others. Some people are more susceptible to depression than others. Some people are incredibly resilient. I mean, I know people that should be depressed. I mean, you know, you look at their life and you go, my goodness, come back tomorrow when you're depressed. You should be. I'd be depressed. But they're just, their system is different. So did I tell you all in class how to kind of know if something's biological or not? Did I tell you the 3 questions I asked to see how much something's biological? Because when you hear me say it's nature, nurture, choice, and that there really is a biological piece to depression, I think the question I'd want to know is, well, how do I know what? I mean, how much? And I thought I talked about this one day, but I'll just say it real quick. The 3 questions would be, when was the onset? The earlier the onset, the more likely it's biological. So if somebody has been depressed since they were, 7 years old, I'm going to say by this time your serotonin is caught up with. I mean, that's going to be more difficult. That's going to be more stubborn because of the early onset. So when was the onset? Second, was there an event that would explain it? Like, was there a crisis but if they don't have an event that might explain it, then I'm going to think that's probably more biological. Does that make sense? So how early was the onset? Is there a preceding event that would have predicted depression? And then last, is there a family history of it? And if you answer no to all those, then I go, great. That means I have more room to work with than probably 30 or 40%. But if they say yes to all those, I'm going to say I need to get a medical doctor involved as well, because that's probably going to be more stubborn. Does that make sense? So nature, nurture, choice when it comes to depression. So let's talk about that sense of hopelessness that we sometimes have with depression. And let's talk about suicide. Suicide has a bimodal distribution in the population, and that's a fancy way of saying there's a bump at adolescence and there's a bump in the elderly. I sat with the prime timers this past week, and because we just had somebody kill themselves, there was a part of me that I was just looking out, and there is something, there is something a little bit depressing when you can't do some of the things you used to be able to do. I used to be a male model. Well, that's not true, but there's things I can't do that I used to be able to do, and there's a little bit of sadness that goes with that. And so, why would there be a bump in adolescence and in the elderly? And I think it's because both of them are dealing with disappointment from a different direction. An adolescent, once he gets abstract reasoning, they begin to realize, gosh, I'm probably not going to be, I'm probably not going to be in the NBA. I'm probably not going to write the great American novel. I'm probably not going to, I might be the coolest person in this middle school, but there's 1,000 middle schools in the state of Tennessee, and then there's a quadrillion of them, and maybe I'm not such a big deal after all. And so one of the most important things for an adolescent to develop, to become healthy, is how do they deal with the gap between their condition and their calling? Because they don't feel that until they get abstract reasoning. But once they get abstract reasoning, they can look and say, gosh, what if I'd grown up in that neighbor's house? I'd be different. What if I had this? And and so an adolescent is kind of the first time they taste the angst of living in a fallen world. And so when they do, they're a little more susceptible to depression. So they're looking at life this direction and saying, gosh, it's harder than I thought. And people in my age group are looking at it this direction going, is this all there was? I mean, did I accomplish everything I wanted? I thought by now I wouldn't struggle so much. Or I thought by now I'd be better. Or I thought by now, I'd be, on the beach in Belize. That's not my dream, I promise, but sometimes it does seem intriguing. So depression is a bimodal distribution. So here's what you need to do when you are talking to somebody and they give you, usually they won't say they're about to commit suicide. Usually they'll have some veiled threat. It'll be something like, it's just not worth it. I tell you what, my kids would be better off without me. Nobody'd give a damn if anything happened to me at all. Now, you say, well, those are things, everybody feels those things sometimes. I always take that as a veiled threat of suicide. And so I ask the person, are you suicidal? And if you ask somebody, are you suicidal? And they're not going to be offended. Here's what they're going to do. They're going to go, no, I wouldn't kill myself. That's stupid. But I'm just tired. Okay. But you have asked the question. Are you thinking about killing yourself? So whenever there's suicide ideation, that's a tip of the hat toward hopelessness, a tip of the hat toward life. Life's not going to get better. I'm stuck, and it's not going to get better from here. What you want to do is you want to turn toward them and say and ask direct question. Now, I know some of you, and some of you go, well, I don't want to give them the idea. In America today, you're not giving somebody the idea of suicide. I mean, suicide is a somewhat common cause of death, and that would be like saying, I'm not going to tell somebody to put on their seatbelt because I don't want them to, to think about that, because I don't want them to, if they haven't put it on, I don't want them, no. People are dying of suicide, and you're not going to give somebody that idea. No one's going to go, I wasn't thinking about it, but since you mentioned it, that seems like a great idea. No, that will not happen. I've never had anybody get mad at me for asking. Now, some of them have been a little bit snooty. I mean, like, what do you mean suicide? I wouldn't do, I'm going to do it, but they've never become, and if you just say, well, you matter to me, and I just had to ask. So you ask them, and they don't give you a definitive no. Even if they do give you a definitive no, go one step further. And that step further is, do they have a plan? Are they talking about suicide, and is there a plan? So what would you do? How would you kill yourself? Oh, I don't know. Well, if they said, I drive off the Gay Street Bridge at 60 miles an hour, that's a plan. Is it a lethal plan? Yes. So I want to find out. I want to be very specific and ask about suicide. If they cannot clearly say, that's not where I'm going, I'm going to push a little further and say, well, do you have a plan? I mean, have you thought about it enough to where you've got a kind of way you do it? And if they go, no, I'm just tired. Push just a little bit more and see if they'll eventually say, but you can have a little bit of confidence if they push back twice on that. But you still want to get a commitment that they won't kill themselves. And you want to get a commitment for community around them. The way to think about suicide is I want a commitment. I want to buy time, commitment, and community. I want people around them. I want to buy time because usually the desire to really go through with suicide is a temporary place. And so I want to buy time. So I'll sometimes say, can you promise me that you won't do this for 3 weeks? Or can you promise me that we're going to get together next Tuesday? Can you promise me that you won't do this till Tuesday? And sometimes I get them to sign something that's not worth the paper it's written on, or I get them to shake hands or say, no, I'm trusting you with this. But I look, are they suicidal? Do they have a plan? Is the plan specific, and is the plan lethal? I had a person call me one time late at night. They said, they called, Dr. Coffield, I'm sorry to call you at home. I got your number from wherever they got it. And said, I've taken a lot of pills, and I need help. And so, if you want to just jump out of bed pretty quickly, and so I immediately said, okay, I've got to find out where they are. I said, so where are you calling from? Because in case, if somebody had just taken something, never know. And I said, so where are you? And trying to find out, now, is there anybody else in the house with you? And so I'm going through all the things you would do to kind of get to get some kind of things in place if there's an emergency later on. And I said, so now tell me exactly what you've taken. And this girl said, well, I took aspirin. Now, aspirin, a lot of aspirin can be. And I said, so how many did you take, and when did you take that? And I've now written down by the phone, where the address is. And she says, well, I've taken 3, but I've got 7 more that I'm thinking about taking. Now, I didn't hang up on her at that moment. It was a plan, and it was specific, but it wasn't lethal. And I assured her that I wanted her parents were at the house, and I said, I want you to go and wake your parents up. And I got community for her to be there. I got a commitment for her to, I want you to come in tomorrow and talk. But all of a sudden the crisis level went down because it wasn't lethal. What's an example of lethal? I had, it's funny, when I left RTS, I cleaned out the drawers of my desk, and I had bullets. I had a couple of bottles of prescriptions. I had, at one point, I'd returned it, I had a gun in there because I want to take away the means of them to commit suicide. And so now I usually don't want to be that person. I want somebody that's in their regular community to be that person. I want a friend, a family member, or to be the person that takes that away. But in some cases, you just want to take away the lethal things. It's interesting that the people working with Matt this past month did that. Matter of fact, they did everything I'm saying you should do. They got that person to extra help. They got family involved. They got his brother came down. They did a lot of these things. And so the moral of that story is sometimes even if you do the right things, you can't control another person's behavior like we'd like to. I think if Matt had any idea of the sorrow that would billow from his community, maybe, but when you're stuck in that depression, you don't sense that. So that's what you want to do when somebody's suicidal. Now let me just tell you a couple of risk factors to be aware of that heighten it. If a family member or someone in their community has committed suicide, that heightens the risk. I've already explained why that's the case. If, real quick, just who's most likely, what demographic is most likely to commit suicide in America? White man, Asian man, white woman, black woman. What subgroup is most likely to commit suicide in our country? It's so counterintuitive. It is so counterintuitive. Most people would say, well, it's probably black women because they are some of the most oppressed and deal with so much difficulty. I mean, there's so much difficulty. And the least likely would be white men because they probably have the most, it's right the opposite. White men are most likely to be the demographic that kills themselves, and black women are the least likely to kill themselves. Now, that doesn't mean if you're seeing a black woman and she says she's suicidal that you go, you're not going to kill yourself. You've got more resilience in it, the rest. So no, but just be aware of that dynamic. Often there's a disinhibitor involved when somebody kills themselves. A disinhibitor would be alcohol, drugs, pornography, anything that would make the person less connected to the moment or to the and so that if you talking to somebody and they're you're talking to somebody and you're kind of worried, how big a deal should I make this? If it's if they are if they fit these categories, think of this, it's a bigger deal. So there's greater risk because these are heightened risk factors. So if I'm seeing somebody and I know they're an alcoholic, and they're talking about then I'm going to see that. I'm going to take that more seriously because the risk factor goes up. If someone has guns, women are more likely to attempt suicide. Men are more likely to complete suicide, and the reason men tend to use more lethal ways to kill themselves than women. Women usually use pills to kill themselves, and often because God put in us a desire to live, not die, they will, after they've ingested them, they'll make a phone call and say, I just did this and help me, because they kind of come to their senses a little bit. There's not much opportunity to come to your senses after you've shot a gun. So a disinhibitor, if there's guns in the home, if there's alcohol or pornography use, anything that would regularly kind of take them from being present and kind of put them in a fantasy place is what I would call a disinhibitor, and that's risk. If there's other mental illness, schizophrenia, if there's other significant mental illness issues, then the risk factor goes up. Often with women, and this is not a very broad brush, but often with women, it is relational oriented, and they would kill themselves. And with men, it is often significance oriented, like I lost my job, I can't take care of my family, I failed, I'm bankrupt, I haven't been able to handle those sort of things. Now, that's not always the case, but just be aware of those kinds of risk factors as they increase. Does all that make sense? So, and then what you want to do, you want to buy time, you want to buy commitment, and you want to get community, get people around them. And in most of our cases, we want to refer them to somebody who is going to kind of walk through this even more with them. And so offer to go with them to, listen, why don't you go to a counselor, or why don't you go to a pastor? Go, and I'll go with you. You're not alone. So that's all the, but just to put it in perspective, I asked this question. My daughter and son-in-law, Kim and Noah, are doing great. They're wonderful. But their struggle with infertility has been difficult, and it's been really taxing on their marriage, and because they deal with it so differently, and so they're actually, they're actually going to just take a couple of days away from each other, because it was kind of getting really chippy at home. Thought it was a good idea. They love each other. They're going to do fine. Noah said, "I'm going out to the woods. I know Mona's gone, and if you need help, I'll have my phone with me. I'll be glad to help." And I texted back, "Are y'all okay? Either one of you suicidal?" Now, I think I knew the answer before I asked it. But because I've been on the other side of the phone calls in my life, I'd rather have asked and they tell me no than to not have asked and wondered, what should I have done? There's not a person in this church that has not said something like, when you heard that Matt killed himself, could I have done something? Or should I have done something? Or what, do I know Matt? Or because he was in my class, what could I have done? Because that's what suicide does to people. And so you want to, it's ultimately a desperate act that the person doesn't realize how selfish it is often when they're in the middle of it, but it's a very selfish act ultimately. So we're talking about mood disorders tonight. I've tried to give a biblical way for you to think about depression. And therefore, a biblical way to kind of enter into somebody who's depressed with better questions and just don't be depressed anymore. Be happy. Stop being depressed and begin to say, now I've kind of got an idea of what to look for that might help them kind of move through the depression instead of instead of just kind of making them feel bad about being depressed. And so just kind of want to chat with you about that. We talked about depression. We gave symptoms clinically for it. And we've talked about the difference between depression and just sadness that kind of comes with living in a fallen world. I think there's a godly depression, if you will, that is not. I think if you read 2 Timothy, it's hard for me as a psychologist to read 2 Timothy and not go, Paul's a little depressed. I mean, could you bring my coat before winter? Nobody stood up and defended me at my trial. Would somebody bring my books? I mean, I'm not going to diagnose him and offer him serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but I'm just saying, I can't give people medicine, by the way. I'm the wrong kind of doctor for that. But I think there's a godly depression that kind of, I think you're supposed to grow in life, and I hope this doesn't sound Eeyore-ish, because at my age, if you listen real closely, you can almost hear the laughter on the other side. I think that's a Larry Crabb quote. But the shiny starts coming off as you get older. It's sad when the shiny comes off a 17-year-old. They've had so much trauma, so many difficult things in their life that there's no shiny left. But I think we're supposed to live life in such a way that so much toward Christ that by the end we kind of go, come Lord Jesus, come. Just come on. There's nothing on this side of heaven that's worth the wait. So just come on. Now, you don't feel that way when you're 15 or 17 or 19 or you just get married. You kind of go, oh no. But when as you get older, I think that, and so I think there is a godly sadness. It's not probably clinical depression, but I think that people have once they kind of face and live life. So we can't finish mood disorders without talking a little bit about bipolar stuff. By the way, who's more likely to be diagnosed with depression, women or men? Women. And why would that be? Because of their small little brains? No. That's not true. That's not true. Their brains are bigger. It's because serotonin, the look on a couple of your faces was like, is he serious? Did he just say, men have always been afraid of how smart women are. Men have always been afraid of how strong women are. So the way we deal with that is we, just try to avoid you all at all costs. But one of the reasons women struggle with depression is that serotonin dances with estrogen. And so it interplays well with estrogen. And so serotonin levels will be impacted by estrogen levels. And so when a woman is in her cycle, there's times where there's more emotion. Well, that's not because, there's something wrong with you. No, it's because that system is built for serotonin to interact with estrogen. And so there's a little bit of a dance that it does. And that's why postpartum depression, most of that is biological because of the estrogen level shifts so much during birth and during that whole process of menopause. There's often a shift in mood around that because estrogen is doing a dance with that. It's gonna be not quite as stable, and so just be aware of that. We've got to talk. If we can't talk about mood disorders without at least tipping our hat to the bipolar sort of stuff. All of us have moods that go up and down, and sometimes because our mood levels isn't just how you think. There's a biology to it. There's chemicals that go with mood. Because of that, you've got you're going to have, all of us are going to have seasons where we're kind of up and we're down, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think in our culture, one of the things we've done in the psychological world is we have not looked at a biblical answer to the angst that's in the room. The reason we have angst and the reason we struggle with depression and sadness is we live in a fallen world. You were made for Eden. You were made for Eden. You were made to walk with God and know Him. And you were designed, your physiology, your brain was designed for Eden and heaven and glory. And instead it lives in a fallen world where something's wrong with everything on this side of heaven. And so it would be pretty normal to have moods fluctuate, just as you honestly kind of live in this fallen world. What the psychological world has done, because they won't talk about it in terms of the reason for the angst, they're always looking for a reason that we have angst. And so the book that they have diagnosis in is called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it lists all the possible disorders. It's a great book to read if you just want to feel crazy someday and just go, I've got that, I've got that, I've got that. But what and every time they put out a new edition, it gets bigger. And what they're always looking for is an answer for the angst. And one of those is bipolar now. The reason that we have angst is that because our emotions go up and down. And so bipolar used to be manic depressive disorder, which was pretty significant. It had to go all the way to mania. It had to go all the way down to depression, and that's pretty significant. And they said, yeah, but more people are a little less than that. And that's where you got bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 when the last DSM came out. And what I call it is there's kind of a disorder du jour. The psychological world will find a disorder that they think, okay, this explains the angst. This explains what we know to be the reality of living in a fallen world. And this will explain it away. Anybody under the age of 28 or 29 in our country today, they have been told that any problem they have is related to gender. If they're sad, if they're angry, if they're depressed, if they're lonely, if they feel like they don't fit in, and I've never met a 15-year-old that feels like they fit in, ever. But instead of just saying to that 15-year-old, yeah, you don't fit in because you're changing and your brain's changing, your life's changing, you're going to be okay in a couple of years and we're going to be with you in the process. Instead we say, well, maybe it's because you're really not a woman and that you're really a man in a woman's body. And maybe you'll become much happier if you'll just acknowledge that. And it's amazing to me how many, in the DSM-3, we're on the DSM-5 now, homosexuality was considered a disorder. I mean, and now here we are about 30 years, 40 years past that, and it's like all problems are related to this. And so one of the problems my field has had, the psychological world, is instead of looking at how God made us and saying that we are made, that we live in a fallen world and therefore there's going to be angst in life. That angst is part of who we are as human beings in the image of God living in a fallen world. And God has equipped our brains to survive that, to not be destroyed by it. However, it is going to be difficult because living in a fallen world is difficult. Instead of saying that to somebody, where everybody's looking for the answer to say, now that's what's wrong with you. Once we solve that, then you're going to be okay. And the research is just, the research on the people that have had the sex change operations is not good because they didn't solve the problem. They fixed a symptom. Anyway, I say all that because the disorder du jour for a few years has been in my opinion, bipolar. Bipolar 2. They're bipolar. If I ever don't know what to do with somebody, they're bipolar. Is there a mechanism that is true? Is there such a diagnosis? Yes. But as it is with all of these diagnoses, it's really not best seen as an either or. It's seen as a continuum. All of us have emotions that fluctuate. All of us do. I mean, there's days you're up, there's days you're down, there's days, there's days you kind of don't have much resolve, and there's days you have. I mean, that's kind of a normal ebb and flow of life. But when it becomes higher and the lows become deeper, and they don't seem to have a reason. They don't seem to have a triggering event. They seem to just be random. Gosh, how did they just kind of went down? Then you're going to think of that normal movement of emotion has become problematic. And so it's a continuum. All of us have that. But if it gets to the point where I don't have any control over it, or it feels beyond my ability to look at my blocked goals, or to kind of face some of those issues, I lose that ability, then it kind of gets to the place where it's a diagnosis. But we're all on that continuum. So those are, when it comes to mood disorders, that's bipolar. Real quick, how many of you in this room have someone in your family, now I don't mean your immediate family, I mean extended family, that's been diagnosed with depression? Easy 85, 90%. How many of you had somebody diagnosed with bipolar? Maybe 50%. We are, there's nothing wrong with, having a diagnosis that helps you kind of know what to do or how to help maybe. But we are so quick to label people, and often it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where, and all of a sudden their disorder becomes how you define them. Skylar has autism, but that doesn't fully define him. People who know him find him to be intriguing and interesting, and there's more to him than his autism. And we are more than a diagnosis or a code or a letter or an animal or all the little personality tests that people give you. You are more than that, because you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, with all the beauty and the complexity of what that would mean. Full of dignity, because you're made in the image of God, and depravity, and that battle between those two are constant in all of us. Does that make sense? So, anybody have any questions about depression?
You just said bipolar 1 and 2. Is this a matter of severity?
Well, the original bipolar it had to go all the way to mania. And so in bipolar 2, it only goes to what would they call hypomania. So it would be a little more common. And the truth is, all of us probably at some point get up to, if I don't get enough sleep, I can become pretty obnoxious. At least I've been told that by my wife. And I can get a little bit manicky, and my family starts saying, well, it's time to go to sleep, Jim. You need to. That bipolar 2 would be a little less. If this is bipolar 1, bipolar 2 would be this. And that's why a lot of people get diagnosed with it. They probably don't really have it, but because it's not far from just a common up and down that we'd have. Yes?
So out of all the symptoms that you gave us, does someone have to meet a certain amount to be clinically diagnosed? Because isn't it kind of subjective based on the person that's diagnosing?
It is subjective based on the person that's diagnosed. There is the DSM, they'll list all these different symptoms, and then they'll say you have to have 5 out of the 7, or you have to have, and you have to have them to get depression, if I remember correctly, and I should know this, and you probably do, you have to, it has to be for a period of time, and it's like, is it 6 months?
6 months for some, and some of it is even 2 weeks
Yeah.
for consistency.
And so the severity has to be there, and the length of time has to be there to get the diagnosis. But you're right. I mean, it's a little bit subjective because you're talking about how people process their world, and that requires some self-report. And with all self-report, there can be deception.
Does that go back to when you talk about the refusal to suffer?
Yeah. I don't. The quote by a guy I really like, and I think he's right. The genesis of all mental illness that's not biologically based is a refusal to struggle and to sorrow in a fallen world. I think that's true. And so I'm anxious because I don't want to struggle, or I don't want to get on that Ferris wheel that takes me to hopelessness, despair, then hope in Christ, hope, and then back into loss. I don't want to get back into that. So I refuse to struggle in sorrow. I refuse to live in the present. So we'll talk about anxiety next week, and one of those things, or 2 weeks from now, one of those things would be PTSD, which you've heard a lot about, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's ultimately an avoidance disorder, but what happens is people, because they're avoiding things, the traumas, they end up not being present, and they don't live in the suffering and the struggle. They don't go through it. They try to get around it, and therefore they end up getting ironically stuck in it. So, but we'll talk about that next time. So here's the deal. Next week, I'm going to be at a Johnny and Friends camp, which is a camp for families with non-typical kids. And I go every year because if I speak, then Skylar goes for free. And so this is my 4th year speaking, and we get a nicer cabin, and we get to go for free. So as important as I think this is, and it's kind of amazing as I think you all are to come here on a Sunday night, I'm not coming next week. And so we will skip a week and then come back in 2 weeks. So any other questions about depression before we finish? Yes?
So is there a need at all to explain like the spiritual battle behind it, as far as like the enemy constantly attacking us when we deal with depression?
Yeah, I mean, it is helpful to know for anybody that there's an enemy to your story of glory. I mean, we are all in a story war between the story of glory that God is writing and the story of shame and sorrow and regret that Satan is writing. And he is a relentless writer, and he knows your story. He knows your failures, he knows your mistakes, and he hounds you with those. And so there is a spiritual spiritual battle, what I would call a story war between the story that ultimately we know the end of, and he does win, a story of glory and a story of despair and shame that Satan is writing. And it's helpful for somebody to know that there's an enemy to your story. And it's also helpful to know that because of depravity, you can start to become very comfortable with your disorders. I mean, depression kind of works for you in a way. If I'm depressed, I don't have to, if I come late to work, nobody will say, Jim, aren't you supposed to be here at 8:30? I'd be like, oh, I think he's struggling a little bit. Well, there's a way in which depression can work for us. And so you add that to it, and it's kind of like, so much of life is about a momentum toward glory, momentum toward Satan's plan or evil, and just shifting that momentum. The way Paul would have described it is the old battle between the old man and the new man. He might not talk about a story war, but that's essentially what he's talking about when he says, that battle between the old man and the new man is a battle between two stories. The old story is a story of an orphan that's lost and not loved, and the new story of one who's been chosen by God and has hope. So, all right, well, let me pray for us, and then we're done for the day. Father, as we've talked about our lost dreams, that may have poked some things in some of the people here. And maybe you've helped them see that where some of their sadness and depression comes from. But would you meet them this week and let them know that you are writing a story of glory in their life, not a story of despair. I pray that you would take this material we've talked about today, Father, and if to whatever level it could be helpful, I pray that you would have us use it in the lives of the people you bring before us. Thank you for trusting us like you do in the people's lives that are around us. Give us a courage to be bold and loving. Pray this in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen.